Thank you. So today I'll be speaking about closure and defeat, two great epistemological problems together at last. Just an overview of the structure of the talk. The first three sections are about the problem of closure, and the last two are about the problem of defeat. And I'll try to say something at the very end about the structural similarities between the two problems and why I think they actually do, in the end, admit of something like a common solution. So I'll start by talking about closure. I'll begin with the standard formulation of the closure principle. What it says intuitively is that knowledge is, in an interesting sense, closed under competent deduction. If you start with knowledge, and what you do is engage in competent deduction, you don't lose your knowledge in the course of your competent deduction. You should end up having extended or at least preserved your knowledge through the course of the deduction. This formulation of the closure principle here is John Hawthorne's, and it's current industry standard of the closure principle. And I will say that is one good-looking epistemic principle. It's very hard to find fault with it. I actually am going to find fault with it in the talk. I think this doesn't quite capture what we want a closure principle to capture. So what I'll be doing here is defending closure, but I'll actually be attacking Hawthorne's formulation of the closure principle. I think there's a problem with the principle. The problem comes in right here, where the laser is shining on that second occurrence of P. There's something that hasn't quite been specified there, and I'm going to try to specify it and give actually a slightly more restrictive formulation of the closure principle, which I think better captures what we want to say in exactly this neighborhood. So I'm defending closure, just not quite defending Hawthorne's version of it. Now, I've said this is a very attractive epistemological principle. The only reason why we've ever been driven to have doubts about it is, of course, that it can seem that embracing the principle, and in fact, I think, as a matter of fact, embracing this formulation of the principle can lead you into trouble. The trouble has a name. I've given it the name the HARMAN-VOGEL paradox. It originates with the work of Fred Dretske, who I think didn't really think it was a paradox. He was willing to embrace a solution to it which just amounted to giving up closure. But both Gil Harman and Jonathan Vogel, I think, are friendlier to the principle of closure, and so for them it really was a paradox. So I'm naming it after them. Paradox is doubtless familiar to everyone in the room, but I'll walk through the key examples. There are many more of them. I've given you some extra examples on your handout as well. I'll walk through the key examples because I want to then make a sort of structural point about how they are working. So we can start by asking a really easy question about the identity of the President of the United States. And I take it that this is a question that you're able to answer. In fact, I take it that everyone in the room knows the answer to this question. Certainly, if we don't know the answer to this question, then there's probably quite a lot that we don't know. So you want to say, look, this should be an easy case of knowledge. Famously, this easy question can be followed up with a harder question. And this harder question can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable about our epistemic predicament. Now, supposing that it's been about 10 minutes since any of us checked our devices. We've been on a kind of media blackout in this room. And we really reflect seriously on the idea that sometimes actually healthy individuals about the age of Barack Obama do die unexpectedly of natural causes. National leaders are at particular peril of being assassinated. Do we right now know for a fact that Obama has not died in the last 10 minutes or since I began speaking? And you reflect on that question, and it can feel like you could certainly say, look, it's highly likely that he hasn't died. It's probably 0.999 probable that he's still alive right now. But it feels actually a little bit more awkward to claim that we know he has not died in the last 10 minutes. That looks like it's something that's harder to say. Similar kind of example. You look at this and you can identify it easily as a zebra. But then you introduce the concept of the cleverly disguised mule, where we say, look, with a bit of body paint and veterinary hairstyling, we take an animal which is in fact a mule, and we convert it in such a way that a photograph of that disguised animal from about this distance would be pixel by pixel indistinguishable from the friendly zebra we saw on the last slide. And then it gets more awkward to say that we know that this is not a cleverly disguised mule. I mean, if you really reflect on that problematic scenario and the character of your evidence in this slide, we can feel a bit uncomfortable. And of course, the reason why these cases and other cases that are structurally similar to them are uncomfortable for us is that the proposition that we found easily knowable, Barack's the president right now, that was a zebra, it not only entails but is known to entail, either on its own or maybe with the help of auxiliary premises whose status as knowledge is not in question for us right now, like that zebras and mules are distinct species of animals. It entails the proposition that seems hard to know. So the question is, why can't we just come to know that harder proposition by deduction, invoking that very attractive principle of closure that we saw on the early slide? So we start knowing that it's a zebra, and why can't we just deduce then that it's not a cleverly disguised mule? Or if we do attempt that kind of deduction from our knowledge that Barack Obama is the president, say, let's deduce that his being the president right now entails that he must be alive, and therefore it's not the case that he's died in the last 10 minutes. Why does that kind of deduction, if we attempt it, feel like it doesn't quite generate knowledge? It feels like an exercise in bad faith to say, okay, now we know that he hasn't been assassinated in the last 10 minutes. In fact, if you try to attempt the deduction, what starts to feel like it's the case is that we've actually lost knowledge of our starting premise. Oh, great. Now we don't know for a fact that Obama is the president. All we have epistemic access to is that it's highly likely that he's still the president. It's probable that that animal was a zebra as opposed to a cleverly disguised mule, and so on. And unfortunately, the problem really generalizes so that it can seem that for almost anything you might have thought you knew, you're at best able to say rationally that it's highly likely. And actually, you can probably worsen it downwards from there. But I'm satisfied with taking it that far. This seems like an awkward and uncomfortable result. It seems sort of paradoxical. I contend that this phenomenon is something that is generated by a switchover between two ways of thinking that we ordinarily have at our disposal. These cases in the HARMAN-VOGEL paradox, this whole class of cases, are actually exploiting a little gap of ours between two modes of thinking we have, which are both very natural to us. Later, actually, I can also say there's some versions of the HARMAN-VOGEL pattern that can be generated by moving from reflective thinking to more detailed reflective thinking. You can generate the problem that way as well. But the easiest cases, and the cases which are all common in the literature, are cases which are generated just by a switchover from intuitive to reflective thinking. So I want to take a moment to sort of explain how I would characterize this distinction, and then how we can amend the closure principle so that we don't tumble into this gap between these two modes of thought. Intuitive thinking is executed without awareness of any sequential progression in thought. So face recognition, when you look at this picture and see it as a picture of Helen Mirren, face recognition is intuitive to us. It is, in fact, an inferential process in the sense of a process that draws on a variety of attributes in order to form a judgment. But it's not an explicitly inferential process. That is, we don't have sequential awareness of an array of features which then we reason about, and that produces a judgment as to the nature of the person. In fact, if you try to sort of articulate how it is that you knew that it was her, you might list some sort of easy to articulate features of, maybe her face, her hair color, and so on. That actually doesn't map onto how the process of face recognition actually works. It actually works through some not introspectively available calculations about the geometry between certain key points on the face. If I distort those features of the geometry of the face, you won't recognize it as her anymore. If I change her hair and eye color, you'll have no problem, however. So that I call a process intuitive doesn't necessarily mean that it's simple. It could be very complex, but it's not introspectively available. It's not articulated. It doesn't go through a series of conscious. You have a number of cues, and you form a judgment in a way that has a certain epistemic immediacy for you. As soon as you see her, you're aware of who she is. Assuming that this face is in your repertoire, I should say. Of course, if you didn't have the right background with British actors, it might not be there for you. Sequential or reflective thinking, on the other hand, is the kind of thinking we execute when we're, for example, working through a geometrical proof. You're going through a proof of the Pythagorean theorem. There's a series of stages that you have to execute, that you have to bring onto the stage of consciousness. So reflective thinking always involves stages being placed in working memory. And anything that's in working memory is consciously available to you, and it's available to the full suite or a large suite of mental modules that can operate on that available content spontaneously. And in reflective thinking, our cognition is structured by a question. We're trying to get to an answer. We're using each stage that's placed into consciousness as input to the next. So, a standard contrast between intuitive and reflective thinking would be the contrast between the kind of thinking you do when I ask you what you get if you multiply 9 times 11. The answer 99 comes to mind automatically and unbidden. If you divide 9 by 11, however, unless you're a mathematical prodigy, you have to go through a series of stages in mental arithmetic. Those stages that you go through are not available to you consciously then for the rest of your life, fortunately. You've got actually very limited space in working memory. And contents stay there, but only for a limited time. You're not going to be worried about that cleverly disguised mule indefinitely. But I can make you aware of it. And then when it's in your mind, it's available for you, actually whether you like it or not, to play a part in your judgments about all queries that you would recognize as being related or relevant to that content. So that's kind of the beauty of working memory, is that it puts something on stage, makes it accessible. It can also be, in some cases, the curse of working memory, that it places something into your view that your thinking, as long as it's reflective, will take account of. Okay, so intuition and reflection are, if you like to think of it, two sets of tools that we have. We have the rough tools of intuition, which are excellent at executing a large number of automatic and overlearned tasks, like the task of multiplying 9 by 11, or the task of recognizing a famous or a personally known individual. And then we have the fine tools of reflection, which can enable us to handle novel problems, say arithmetical computations that are unrehearsed for us, we haven't done before, and certain kinds of fine problems. And fine problems that have to be handled with these daintier tools include judgments concerning the truth or falsity of hypotheticals, statements of the form if P, then Q. Those demand sequential thinking. You don't have the instantaneous face recognition kind of capacity to judge those. Also, sentential negations. It is not the case that this is a cleverly disguised. It is not the case that Barack Obama has died in the last 10 minutes. In order even to contemplate that proposition, you actually have to formulate in thought the core of it and then negate it and then find reason to cross it out. So those have to be handled. Those have to be handled reflectively. Interestingly, many questions can be handled either way. So, for example, that question about 9 times 11 being 99. Ordinarily we would just produce the answer intuitively. But if you wish to, if you're sufficiently motivated, you can engage in deliberate and reflective digit-by-digit multiplication on that one as well. And likewise, the question of whether Barack Obama is the President of the United States of America. That could just be something you say, yeah, to do automatically, or it could be something that, if you want, you think about in a deliberate and reflective manner. So this is where the problem is coming from in the original pattern. You start with an intuitive judgment about the identity of the president, and then I ask you a question which forces you to think reflectively and which presents a hypothetical possibility of a certain kind about the hypothetical, very recent death of the president. I put a certain scenario in mind for you. It's active. It's in working memory. And then I ask you, when I ask you to try to perform the deduction, to go back to this original question about the identity of the current United States president. And what I have done by introducing that content, which you recognize as relevant to the starting question, is I have now forced you to take a reflective approach to that problem, which you were initially handling in an intuitive manner. So why doesn't the question about the identity of the president feel like knowledge the second time around? When I ask you, after we've thought about the hypothetical recent assassination, I'm going to say it doesn't feel like knowledge because once you're in the reflective mode of thought, you're working with those fine tools which have certain principles of operation. Principle of operation of reflective cognition is that it is dealing with the materials that are consciously available to you. Unlike face recognition, explicit deduction or contemplation of these, unlike face recognition, explicit deduction has to work from premises which are present to you, which are available to you. When I ask you about the recent assassination, you become aware of the dated character of your memory. You'll naturally ask yourself, well, when did I see Obama last? I guess I checked the BBC website before my talk. Maybe it was longer ago than that. But you become aware of certain evidential connections you had to that fact. And just looking at those materials, which are consciously available to you, you can recognize that they're not dispositive as to what has happened in the last 10 minutes. Those materials won't do it for you. The best you can do, just handling those materials that are consciously available, is to make the judgment that it's highly likely that he is still president. So actually we could, in the psychological sense of could, we could judge that Obama is still the president. We could, for example, judge this right now, despite our awareness of the dated quality of our evidence. We could judge it right now on the basis of, for example, wishful thinking. He must be alive. The country needs him, and at last he's starting to speak his mind. But a judgment of that sort, for obvious reasons, isn't going to feel like, it's not going to feel like knowledge. We're reasoning poorly. We're violating the rules of operation of those fine tools. But the fact that we psychologically find ourselves unable to right now make a judgment that feels like knowledge, that Obama is still alive, assuming we continue to take seriously the hypothetical possibility that he's recently died. The fact that right now we can't make that judgment doesn't show that our original naive judgment was epistemically problematic. Presumably, the original naive judgment was true. Let's stipulate that it's true. I'm going to stipulate further, as an epistemologist right now, I'm going to stipulate that it was safely true. Of course, actually, none of us will have knowledge of that key fact if, as a matter of fact, there was an assassination attempt a few minutes ago or something like that. Let's stipulate that none of that has happened. Our naive judgment has, I think, a perfectly reasonable title to have counted as knowledge when we initially made it, even if we can't make a judgment of the same proposition that Obama is the president, even if we can't make that judgment right now that we've entered the reflective mode of thought and started to think about that problematic hypothetical scenario. So what's happened is we switched to a new way of thinking. Originally, we were thinking about this animal naively, just looking at it, stripes, it's a zebra. Now we've switched to a way of thinking which is reflective. We're no longer going on our knee-jerk animal identification. We are attempting to do some kind of calculation about the identity of the animal based on cues that we've now started to think of as ambiguous between zebra and cleverly disguised mule. And in that frame of thought, there is no good way, epistemically good way, to simply just judge that that's obviously a zebra. But assuming that the knee-jerk reaction was made in conditions where it was safely executed, it wasn't made in a zoo, let's say, run by practical jokers, but in a zoo with perfectly ordinary animals, I think that naive judgment has a perfect right to count as knowledge. So I promised you that I could try to formulate the closure principle so that it would be better protected against this paradoxical class of cases. And now I'm going to try to do it. I think the problem in Hawthorne's formulation of the closure principle is right here. You start by stipulating that the subject knows that P. So far, so good. And then that they competently deduce Q from P. In order to execute the judgment, in order to execute the competent deduction, it's not enough that you know that P. It has to furthermore be the case that your judgment that P, it has to furthermore be the case that you judge that P, right? Because exactly because competent deduction is a reflective process which works through a sequence of judgments. So just having the background knowledge that Obama is the president isn't sufficient to competently deduce that he hasn't died in the last 5 minutes. You have to furthermore make the explicit judgment. You have to have the occurrent state of mind, which you explicitly judge that he is the president right now. And the problem is, if you're in the frame of mind where you've started to think about problematic hypothetical possibilities and you've become reflective, then you're in a position where your judgment, if you can make the judgment at all, it'll be on the basis of something like wishful thinking. It won't be a naive judgment anymore. It'll be a judgment that's badly reasoned to, and so this formulation of the closure principle enables would enable you to have a judgment not constituting knowledge form the basis of your deduction, and then you'd still, according to this principle, end up with knowledge of the consequent. And that's a little awkward. Incidentally, you might think that as soon as somebody judges that Obama is the president, just on the basis of something like wishful thinking, when he's in that reflective mode of thought, his less than knowledgeable judgment about the proposition that P is enough on its own to undermine his claim to have standing state knowledge of the proposition that Obama is the president. If you think that that's the case, so you can't unknowingly judge that P if you have that underlying state of knowledge that P, that is, the judgment which fails to constitute knowledge cancels your underlying standing state of knowledge. If you think that way, then you've just got a view where the antecedent of the closure principle is harder to attain than maybe Hawthorne had thought it would be. So you still wouldn't have violations of closure on that way. But if you think it's possible for somebody to judge badly that P is the case, despite their underlying knowledge that P, then we do need to tighten up the closure principle a little bit. And this is my stab at doing it. It's still not terrifically elegantly formulated, but let's work through it. So here's, I think, a better formulation of closure than Hawthorne's. If you've got a judgment that P that manifests your knowledge that P and forms the basis for a competent deduction that Q, on the strength of which you come to believe that Q, while retaining your knowledge that P, then you come to know that Q. This formulation of closure insists that your judgment from which you start the deduction has to itself manifest knowledge. So if you've moved into that reflective mode of thought where you have no good way of judging that P is the case, then you won't be able to satisfy the antecedent of this condition. And that explains why you can't come to have knowledge of the animal's identity as a zebra through deduction, or Obama's continued existence through deduction from your original naive knowledge. Your naive knowledge might be there, but you're unable to access through it in occurrent judgment. Okay, so much for closure, and on to the problem of defeat, which I think is structurally similar in character. So when I was talking about closure, I was taking sort of a somewhat externalist approach to the subject, saying, you know, your naive mode of thinking about zebras and presidents could be perfectly acceptable if, for example, it was made in conditions where it was safe, it was latching you onto the truth. And even if you couldn't articulate your, you couldn't even necessarily articulate your reasons for thinking that Obama's the president right now, I think actually that would probably be okay. However, that kind of externalist way of thinking about naive judgments has been challenged, I think, in a particularly acute way by puzzles concerning defeat. So we'll work through sort of the classic contrast in the puzzle of defeat. It's a contrast between a good case and a bad case, and these are on your handout. So in the good case, we have good case Gordon, who's facing a bright red wall. His eyesight is normal, the lighting is normal. No funny spotlights, no hanky-panky. He forms a judgment that the wall is red. Does he know that the wall is red? Well, he had better if we're not going to tumble into skepticism. This looks like a very easy case of knowledge. And it should retain that status, except that we can also think of a variant on the case, which superficially seems like it shares all the external characteristics of the original good case Gordon situation. So here's the defeat case involving Deanna. She also is facing a bright red wall, and her eyesight is just as good as Gordon's, and the wall is the same distance, and the lighting is the same. It looks like all the external circumstances are precisely the same. However, famously, she's been given good reason to believe that there is something wrong or maybe what seems like good reason to believe, that there is something wrong with her situation, that she's been administered a drug that disrupts color perception and, say, inverts red and green. And you can make that evidence seem really strong indeed. Perhaps this is her 10th or 20th visit to the color perception laboratory, and she's had the drug many times before and has seen it to work in a certain way. She's just been given a liquid that tastes just like the liquid last time. But I'm going to stipulate that, in fact, she's been given a placebo and her color vision remains entirely normal. I'll further stipulate, to help us out of this case, that she wasn't really at risk of receiving the drug. But the question is, does she know that the wall is red, as long as she's made aware of all this misleading evidence concerning the drug? And here I'm gonna say that intuitively, it seems like she doesn't know this. And in fact, even people who are willing to say that she does know, grant me the point about what seems intuitive in this case. It would be irrational for her to declare the wall to be red. And in fact, when you first sort of work through the case, you think, well, why would she even believe that the wall is red? We're just going to stipulate that she forms that belief despite her awareness of the misleading evidence. So the question is, does this belief which she has formed, under circumstances superficially very similar to Good Case Gordon's formation of a belief in the same proposition that the wall is red, does this belief that she has formed constitute knowledge? And it looks like if you're going to be an externalist, you should have to say yes, and yet intuitively it seems that the right answer to this question is no. And there are various ways to try to handle this kind of problem. One way is through what I guess Lasson and Arnio calls brute force. You just add in to your theory of knowledge some kind of condition outlawing undermining evidence. I think this is very elegantly done in the classical Indian tradition, where in addition to the so there's sort of tripartite analysis there as well. You start with the condition that knowledge must be a truth-hitting cognitive episode. To that you add the further condition that it must be born of an unfailing justificatory factor, or in some versions of the tradition, an undeviating causal factor. That's a kind of justification condition. And as a brute force addition, in fact motivated by cases exactly like this, where your belief in fact has, it seems, been well formed, but you've been given reason to believe it might not have been. There is in the Nagel tradition a move of saying it must furthermore be the case that no grounds for doubt have arisen. So if you fail that condition, what you have is not knowledge. And there's various versions of that kind of move in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy as well. So Alvin Goldman fools around with it, with just adding this idea that, okay, there can't be any defeaters. And I think there's something kind of awkward about that sort of brute force addition of a no defeaters clause. Larry Bonjour says, look, this looks like just an untenable halfway house between internalism and externalism. Because if you're an externalist, you don't ever demand most externalists don't have to demand conscious awareness of supporting grounds for a proposition that you want to believe. So why should we be so squeamish about the conscious availability of defeaters or evidence that would weigh against the proposition that you're judging? That seems like a kind of weird asymmetry there. And so that's a little awkward. There are other ways to go to handle the defeated belief case, or the Gordon and Deanna contrast. One way we could go is to kind of bite the bullet. I actually looked for images of bullets and bullet biting, and I couldn't find anything very satisfying. And I remember the Brazilian expression for this is to swallow the frog. Like there's something that's kind of unpalatable, and there it is, it's in your mouth. Sometimes you just have to swallow it down. but it's kind of a horrible thing to do. But you could just say, all right, there's this contrast between Gordon and Deanna, and you know what? Deanna knows. I'm going to call that a case of knowledge. So there. And so this is the kind of way that, for example, Maria Lasson-Arnio has gone. And she said, you know what? Maybe it doesn't feel like a case of knowledge because Deanna's in fact doing something that often leads to failure. You know, there she is thinking irrationally, thinking in a kind of crazy way. But sometimes crime pays. And this just might be one of those cases where you do something really risky and you end up with the desired product. And again, I think that's one way to go. But if we can find an analysis of this case which doesn't force us to do something so counterintuitive, I think that might be attractive. And I should say, actually, I think there's a variety of other ways you can go with this case as well. You could go Pritchard's way and say, well, Deanna sees that the wall is red, but she doesn't thereby know that that's the case. I'm not inclined to accept that either. I think it's more elegant to seeing that something is the case as always entailing knowing that it's the case. So what I want to do is something should be coming up on the next slide, which is something that's really not going to come as a surprise at all, right? So you'll notice that in the Deanna case, it's only problematic if she is aware of the bearing of the misleading evidence on this very perceptual judgment that she's being invited to make. It can't just be that she has some background evidence that points to, you know, at some point today you're going to be facing a wall, and she doesn't realize, oh my God, this is the wall. This is the situation in which the possibility of my distorted color vision play a part. She has to be thinking of herself at this moment that there's this problematic hypothetical possibility of color reversal. That has to be on the stage. It has to be in working memory for her. And it is a content which, if she's thinking about it seriously, means that she can no longer make her originally naive perceptual judgments about what's in her environment. As soon as she has that problematic content on the stage of working memory and recognizes its relevance to the very query that she's now engaged in, she's in a reflective mode of thought, whether she likes it or not. She has consciously available content that she's got to process in order to reach a judgment. And with that consciously available content playing a role in her judgment, she has no rational way of judging that this wall she faces is now red. So remember when I was setting up the problem, I said, look, it looks superficially like Gordon and Deanna are, as far as the externalist is concerned, in exactly the same predicament. They are standing the same distance from the wall. The wall is red in both cases. The lighting is the same in both cases. But in fact, as an externalist, you get to say that the external conditions of your belief formation include not only where you're standing, but also what cognitive process you are employing. I'm going to say Gordon and Deanna are employing interestingly different cognitive processes in making their judgments about the character of the wall. And in particular, if Deanna, in full consciousness of the misleading evidence, makes the judgment, and yet this wall that seems to be red is indeed red, she can only get there by reasoning badly. And reasoning badly is not the same process as judging naively that the wall is red. So you have a very straightforward externalist way of explaining why that judgment is not constituting knowledge. It's made in a way that is risky, tends to lead to false beliefs. Reasoning badly is not a reliable way of thinking. So what I want to say sort of structurally about the similarities between the closure cases and the defeat cases is that in both of these puzzles or paradoxes, we're shifting from one way of thinking to another. Some people, most notably contextualists, have argued that what happens when you shift is that your epistemic standards change. Oh, now we're thinking in terms of higher standards, now that we're thinking of, whether the president might have died in the last 10 minutes, I'm not sure that's right. I think actually the standards for knowledge are precisely the same. What has changed is the psychological resources that we are marshaling to make our judgments. And it may well be the case that our psychological resources after the shift, if they are employed to the same standards, will not support precisely the same range of propositions. Just as, if you're making judgments on the basis of vision, and then I give you a pair of glasses which really magnify things or something like that, you may at this point need to stand further away from the zebra or closer to the zebra to have knowledge of its identity. But it's not the case that I have changed the standards for you. You've just been given different equipment for your belief-forming processes. And to reach the same judgments, you may have to do slightly different things with that equipment. So it's sort of like, if you will, you could think of the question, are people taller when they're standing up than they are when they're sitting down? And I want to say, well, not if you're measuring them correctly, right? The height doesn't change at all. When someone sits down, you can still take a fairly accurate measure of the person's height. You just have to know what to do with the tape measure of the person who's in that. If you're measuring a person who's in that posture, you have to do something slightly different. So you don't change in height, but to capture the height across that transition, you have to know what you're doing with the tape measure. And I think actually we are pretty good at knowing what to do with the tape measure, just as intuitive epistemologists, when we're invited to evaluate these cases. I think I'm not, in general, an error theorist. I think, in general, we are actually getting these cases right. You do know, when you think about it naively, that Obama's president, and when you think about the problematic scenario at that point, you're barred from judging that he is the president as long as you're thinking reflectively. Someone who goes ahead and makes the judgment is making a judgment that's not manifesting their knowledge. Because that judgment isn't manifesting their knowledge, can seem like they're losing knowledge. And this is, I guess, one of the places where I do admit some moment of an error theory. I think you can experience the HARMAN-VOGEL progression as if it's a loss of knowledge situation. Oh, I knew a minute ago that that was a zebra, and now I'm not so sure. I feel like I'm losing knowledge when I start to think about these hypothetical cases. It could actually be that you're not losing the knowledge itself. You're just losing temporarily the capacity to make a certain range of judgments. We typically, when we form judgments about the identity of Helen Mirren or about the Pythagorean theorem, we're not separately tracking, oh yes, and this was an intuitive judgment. Oh yes, and this was a reflective judgment. We don't typically consciously register those distinctions, in part because our working memory is very limited in capacity, and we don't want to burden it with this extra conscious flagging of where each judgment came from. But I think as epistemologists, when we're taking these cases back to the lab and unpacking them and trying to figure out why we have the patterns of response to them that we do, it can be very helpful to try and look at the underlying basis of the judgment and try to see what is epistemically significant about the kinds of transformations we go through when we think about one problem, problems of one kind as opposed to problems of another kind. This is something that we ordinarily navigate intuitively, and we do it surprisingly well. But as epistemologists, we're called on to get very reflective about these kinds of transitions to really measure the true significance of our intuitions about knowledge. Thank you.